we're really looking forward to having a conversation with you today, and really that's the way this dialogue should go. We are your typical government bureaucrats, but we will try our best not to be too dry. We will also try our best to keep our remarks to 15 minutes or so, or if not time for that, so we can really focus on the questions and answers from the floor. So between the two of us, essentially we represent the core businesses of the Accessibility Directorate of Ontario. On one hand, I'm the Public Education and Outreach, or also known as the CARET, and on the other hand is Mr. Compliance, also known as the STIC. That's as well. Absolutely. And of course, Ben also helped to develop the policy framework for the legislation and the regulation we'll be discussing today. And so what I understand this morning was a real focus on how to make museums and cultural institutions accessible. And so now we're moving to a little bit of that policy framework, the legislation, the regulations that all of us here as employers need to comply with on various points between now and 2021, for the time being, that will eventually reach 2025. We'll talk a little bit about the business case for accessibility, but we won't dwell on that because I think everybody here gets it. I know Christine had touched on that a little bit earlier. We'll talk about what you have to do as employers and give it our best shot to help make it seem a little less daunting. I know the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation, or the Integrated Regulation for short, can be a little bit daunting if you read it. I've got it here, it's 80-odd requirements. Ben was holding the pen on that in case you have any questions about that. But when you actually break it down year by year, and depending on the nature of your organization, the size of your museum, it's actually not too bad. So we'll talk about that. We'll also talk about how we're here to help, because that really is the focus of the Accessibility Directorate and the work we do, both from a public education, CARET side, and from the compliance side, from the STIC side. We're really focused on helping organizations to be accessible by 2024. So let's see, I've got a remote, and it works. Talking a little bit about accessibility in the business case. Why accessibility in Ontario? Well, the numbers really do speak for themselves. Currently, we have about 1.85 million people in the province living with various forms of disabilities. We also know where the demographics are going in the province of Ontario. We have an aging population, as does the majority of the Western world, both within North America and Europe. So seniors aged 65 plus can more than double to 4.1 million in the province by the year 2036, which isn't far off if we think about it from a public policy perspective and from a long-term planning perspective. And then there's this little tidbit. Our director particularly loves this one. He wasn't able to join us today, but he calls this the aha moment, that by 2017, 5 years from now, for the first time ever in the province, we'll have more seniors than children aged 14 and under. So it's his aha moment. And what that speaks to is the interesting intersection between aging and disability. And certainly I can think about seniors living in my family. They may not be thinking of themselves as having a disability. It's just a certain way we consider the term, but there are intersections between those two. So that's a bit of a business case. The numbers behind accessibility, and quite frankly, it's also the right thing to do. Now, Ontario is a province of firsts, both within Canada and North America, and frankly, around the world. So for the longest time, the accessibility has been doing research and looking at what other jurisdictions within Canada and around the world are doing around accessibility. And it's been a really exciting time to meet with the Accessibility Directorate over the past several years, in that we're now seeing jurisdictions come to us to look at what Ontario is doing around accessibility. So most recently, from within Canada, we've had a lot of conversations with individuals from Manitoba, which is a province that's thinking about pursuing very similar accessibility legislation. I think most recently Alberta, we also heard from Alberta, that we'll be taking a slightly different approach to their accessibility legislation, but same kind of idea in terms of proactive accessibility standards. And then further afield, we hear quite regularly from the United Kingdom and also as far afield as New Zealand. So it's quite an exciting time to be in Ontario. And as the slide says, our jurisdiction is the first in the world to mandate accessibility instead of reacting to complaints. So you see traditional forms of accessibility province has chosen to do, and that's to mandate accessibility for organizations, for employers, and also public, private, and not-for-profit employers. Oftentimes you'll see governments regulating other levels of government, or the MUSH sector, municipalities, universities, schools, and hospitals, but we're one of the first out there to regulate the private sector. We're also the first in the world that requires accessibility training. So first and foremost, I think in our minds in the room will be customer service training that everybody in the room will probably need to have taken by the end of this year. And for those museums with 20 plus employees, you'll need to report on that training to the government. But we're the first jurisdiction in the world that requires, again, public, private, and not-for-profit sectors to train their employees and volunteers on providing accessible customer service. And that's quite exciting. We'll talk about accessible customer service in detail a little bit later. But there's now additional training required under the integrated regulation as it relates to information and communications, employment, and transportation, and also on the human rights code as it relates to accessibility. Don't worry, we have free resources to help you deliver that training within your organizations, and we'll come to that a little bit later. And of course, we're the first jurisdiction in Canada with a very clear time frame to meet our accessibility goals, and that's that year 2025 that I've spoken about earlier. We have all of the requirements in the existing 4 standards being phased in between now and 2025. And the structure and the timing of your requirements depends again on the size and nature of your organization. The Ontario Public Service, lucky us, we always go first. We've chosen to lead by example, as has the Legislative Assembly. And so whenever you see the deadlines, almost all of them will be OPS first, and then the larger, broader public sector organizations, and then eventually not-for-profit organizations and the business community. So I talked a bit about the standards and the nature of Ontario's accessibility standards. These are built upon the foundation of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, the AODA. And I know Constance touched on the standards a little bit earlier this morning, and so we'll go into a little bit more detail about them now. The first of the standards was the customer service standard, which all organizations in the room must have been compliant by January the 1st of this year. I think Constance was going to do a straw poll at a certain point around that, and Ben and I will avert our eyes for a moment. Actually, I said to Constance, I'll keep my eyes open because it gives me an indication of how much work I have to do. And Mr. Compliance here will just keep his eyes closed for a few moments. So the accessibility standards in the province are about enforceable, systemic, proactive standards that impact employers across the province. And again, that's that change in nature from the individual-based legislation to the systemic. They were developed, and Ben was a lead player in this process. They were developed in a rather innovative way for government. Typically, what you see government do is that we'll get approval from politicians from cabinet to go out and explore a given policy issue or challenge. We'll have a consultation, so perhaps a round table, and say, here's what we're thinking, what do you think? Get the feedback and then go away and work on that. And then maybe 6 months down the road or a year down the road, there's a new law or a new regulation. And this one was much different from that. What we did is we brought together the employers and the businesses that would need to implement these potential accessibility standards and persons with disabilities, so the people that they stood to benefit, and brought them together at the table in a 50-50 ratio and said, what can we do? What can we do as a province that makes sense, that's made an Ontario solution to address these accessibility barriers? And the government of Ontario chose to first focus on 5 key areas of daily living that most impact the lives of persons with disabilities. So those being the list on the screen: customer service, information and communications, employment, transportation. Those are the first 4 that are law right now. And the built environment, which is still under development, and one that gets a lot of questions. So perhaps we'll turn to customer service standard, and I'll talk about that a bit. And then we'll speak to the various elements of the integrated accessibility standards regulation. So the accessible customer service standard is the first standard under the AODA. And if I can sum it up, I'd say it's really about culture change. It's really about dialogue. And it's kind of funny to think about government legislating or regulating dialogue, but in a way it created the foundation for the standards that were to follow afterwards. It was a basis on which we could create honest, authentic, open dialogue about accessibility and the nature of disability within the province. And if some of you have taken some of the free online training or perhaps spoken with Christine before or constantly speak, you'll know that a thing that really resonates throughout this standard and throughout the training is best summed up in the form of a question: how may I help you? Accessible customer service can be summed up by asking how may I help you, and then waiting for the answer, and not making assumptions, and then engaging in a conversation about how we, as citizens, can provide accessible customer service to persons with disabilities within our community. And it doesn't need to be much more complicated than that. The work of the Accessible Customer Service Standard will, in one more slide, I'll speak to some of the details of it, but it can really be summed up in just a few key themes. Now, we have a work cut out for us. There's 360,000 organizations across the province that need to comply with the Customer Service Standard. And the criteria is basically every organization in the province with one or more employees that provides goods or services to the public or to a third party. So that's pretty much almost every public-facing business within the province, but also those businesses that interact with each other. So they may not have public customers per se, but they have other businesses or not-for-profits as their customers. So it's a pretty far-reaching standard. And the work of my team is to get the word out there and to teach people about it and to translate the regulation and the legislation into plain language, but tools and resources, online learning modules, brochures, templates. We all love templates, right? Or is that just me? We create those and we do it for fun. And it's our goal to reach the 360,000 organizations across the province, and 60,000 of which have reached that threshold of 20 or more employees. Therefore, they need to report to the provincial government, answer a series of about 10 or so questions about how they're doing with the Accessible Customer Service Standard. And on that note, I would say we do receive the question, how do you count employees? Who counts as an employee? So volunteers don't. But if you have part-time summer students during a peak tourist season, they would count as employees. So if at any point during the calendar year or the previous 12 months you've reached 20 plus employees, that means you will need to report on your accessibility under the customer service standard. And so I'll wrap up by going into a little bit more detail about the customer service standard beyond the theme of how may I help you. It does have a few requirements, and one of which is to set up policies, an accessible customer service policy that details a few different themes or different areas. One of which is simply a commitment to provide accessible customer service. Another is a commitment to allow assistive devices within your organizations and to accommodate those appropriately. Another is to allow service animals into your workplace in areas of your workplace that are normally open to the public. And another is around support persons and welcoming support persons to your organization. And in the event that support persons are required to pay an admission fee, you don't need to waive the admission fees, you just need to post that publicly so that individuals with disabilities who are being accompanied by support persons know that in advance, perhaps by posting it on your website or through signage and so on. There's also a requirement that you train all of your employees and volunteers that deal with the public on your behalf. And we do have free online training for that, but it doesn't need to be complex. You don't even need to put somebody in front of a computer to have them trained. You can do something as simple as giving them a handout and having them read that, and I agree with having read that, so that they understand how your organization welcomes customers with disabilities. And finally, your organization must also put in place a feedback mechanism. So you can receive feedback from customers with disabilities and all customers about accessible customer service and how your museum is doing. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ken to speak to the integrated regulation.
Thanks, Darren. Is this on? Thank you. So as you heard, customer service was really the foundation. What we've done with the snappily and bureaucratically titled integrated accessibility standards regulation is really drill down in specific areas so that persons can really experience accessibility in key areas of their living. The accessibility regulation, the integrated one, has three standards. The information communication standard, which makes organisations send and receive information communications in ways that are accessible to persons with disabilities. The employment standard puts in place processes so that organisations can accommodate both applicants and employees throughout the employment life cycle. And lastly, this one probably doesn't apply to you, is the transportation standard. And this one is all about public transportation like TTC, wheel trains, etc., so that people can more easily get around province to doctors' appointments and businesses and what have you. Wherever possible, the integrated regulation harmonises requirements so that you don't have three separate types of training that you have to do to meet each standard. We've given you as much flexibility as possible so you can build accessibility incrementally in ways that make sense to your business. So really, unlike the customer service standard, where all the requirements were, you had to comply with it all in either 2010 or 2012, depending on the organisation type, this regulation phases in the requirements over time so that you can build accessibility into your daily business and hopefully better succeed. I want to highlight two requirements that came into force in January of this year, and they're both to do with emergency. Firstly, all organisations in January of this year had to create workplace accessibility plans in case emergencies happen within the workplace. Also, organisations, if they made public plans available, for instance, if you've got evacuation plans from your museum, you had to create those in accessible ways so that when persons request them, you'd be able to provide accessible means of evacuations for people. I must stress that both of these requirements are about prepared planning. They're not about emergencies in real time. So they're about accessible information and communications in advance of a situation happening, rather than at the point itself. As Darren mentioned earlier, the Accessible Built Environment Standard is still under development. It is not yet law and the government is considering its options. One of the things that the government did say though in 2009 is that this standard will not apply to retrofit. It's a go-forward standard only. That means if you've got a 100-year-old museum and there are only steps leading up to the front door, you are not required to install a ramp. If you are undergoing extensive renovations, as the Rob recently did, that would be an opportunity to, on a go-forward basis, plan for that kind of adjustment, but you will not have to retrofit. The Built Environment Standard is expected to cover two areas of the built environment, both the buildings themselves and the outdoor public spaces, things like recreational trails, accessible parking spots, and play spaces. The Premier did commit to enacting this standard promptly and responsibly, and so we're waiting for government action shortly. As Darren said, we're more about the carrot than the stick, and what I want to talk to you very quickly about now is our approach to compliance and how we're really helping organisations understand their obligations so that we're putting in place the best path for you to be successful with accessibility. We recognise that accessibility is only going to be as good as an organisation's ability to implement it. So as you can see on the right-hand side of this screen, a great deal of our support and help with organisations is focused on systems. Events such as these that Darren's team most often goes out on is a really key venue for us to be able to spread the word. We also have partnerships with organisations, usually umbrella organisations, that are really able to connect with their membership and spread the word on our behalf so that accessibility becomes a daily message for most organisations in the province. In this way, we're hoping to reach out to 360,000 organisations. We also have a couple of call centres around the province, and I'll give you a number toward the end of this presentation. If you've ever got any problems, concerns about how to comply or how to file a report, please phone the number and there will be people on hand to be able to help you out. Moving through really to the third and fourth segments of this chart, when organisations, in the third segment of this chart, when organisations file reports, if we determine that there has been an instance of non-compliance, our call centre and compliance officers will connect with organisations and really help them improve their behaviour so that we can turn those no's into yeses. Again, it's another example of how Providence is committed to helping organisations really achieve accessibility in a meaningful way. If after all of these efforts have been exhausted and the organisation is still not compliant, we'll make the last segment of this chart really speaks to our approach to inspection and enforcement. We have under the AODA the authority to issue orders and penalties for severe contraventions of the Act and regulations. We have a risk-based framework that we will apply in every instance so that we're really, again, looking to assist and improve organisations before we have to enforce compliance. But of course, that option is available to us. As I said, I just wanted to point out a couple of helpful tips for you. The Ontario.ca/access on the website is a great resource for you. On here you will find tips, information and other resources to help out all organisations meet the regulations requirements. Two of the things that are gradually being placed on this website are plain language guidelines and how-to guidelines. Plain language guidelines are, they basically demystify the regulation, so you don't need to be a lawyer to understand what you need to do. It's in French and English and gives you a really plain language interpretation of the requirement. Darren's shop is constantly evolving and putting out materials that are of a more how-to nature, so I'm sure some of the conversations you had earlier touched on this kind of subject, but Darren's team are really committed to producing scenarios, best case scenarios, so that you can really figure out how accessibility makes sense in practical situations. They are coming, and hopefully we'll have news for you on their complete launch very soon as well. And there's the number for you. We can email this to everybody after the presentation so that you have it at home. If you need to read it with a screen reader, you'll have it on your computer. And I just wanted to end kind of on an aspirational note and talk about what an accessible museum might look like by about 2025. I know we have been in some museums across the province. So many of you are already doing this, and there are great best practices that you can share. I'm sure we're already out there. But touch exhibits where persons with visual disabilities can reach out and tactilely feel the exhibit and collections is really interesting and innovative way to get everybody included in the museum experience. Having large format pamphlets on hand or easily able to be emailed to a person so that they can read it on their BlackBerry or iPhone or whatever. Braille signage where appropriate and caption videos next to exhibitions. None of these are required in the regulation. As I said before, the regulation provides you with flexibility to meet accessibility when you make sense to your museum. But there are some really great ways that a museum can be accessible by 2025. I know I went pretty quick. I know I did not talk in depth about the regulation, but I was conscious of the time. So if you have specific questions